I'm Sienna. I'm the kid.
I'm Sarah. I'm the mom.
This is Queer Kid Straight Mom.
Let's talk. Welcome back to Queer Kid Straight Mom. Today we're talking about which countries in the world are most LGBTQ plus friendly. One of my favorite resources that I found doing research on this, which we will of course link to, is ILGA Europe, an advocacy group working with LGBTQ organizations across Europe and Central Asia. So this only pertains to that part of the world, but it is a rainbow map, which is pretty to look at and gives you a colorful guide of which countries are good, green, down the spectrum to bad, which is red. It's color-coded to show the countries that are most and least friendly based on categories such as equality and non-discrimination, family, hate crime and hate speech, legal gender recognition, intersex bodily integrity, civil society space, and asylum. Malta has topped the rankings for the past 9 years, which I thought was fascinating and kind of surprising. I don't know why. I just assumed they were all going to be Scandinavian countries at the top. But Iceland is second and Belgium is third. Can you guess the three worst?
Russia.
That's one.
Poland.
Nope. One of them starts with a T.
Turkey.
Yep. The other one starts with an A and has a lot of good Scrabble letters in it.
Azerbaijan.
Yes. But anyway, I recommend looking at it. It's just kind of a interesting visual. And, they go into a lot more detail about what they mean by those categories. And, there's a whole list of the whole range. So that's a good one to look at. I found that there are a lot of different angles to look at this issue from. There's just general policy friendliness. There's travel. Travel and Leisure has a list of the safest destinations for LGBTQ travelers. The safest countries start with a 5-way tie for first place: Canada, Malta, New Zealand, Portugal, and Spain, followed closely by Australia, Switzerland, Denmark, Germany, Iceland, Norway, and Uruguay. The US, it says, earns a lukewarm ranking. At the opposite end, the most hostile countries remain Saudi Arabia, Iran, Chechnya, and Afghanistan, all of which still practice the death penalty for homosexuality. Do not recommend travel to those places if you are traveling with a significant other and you are queer. Are there places you have seen that are you've seen terrible stories about gay people traveling there?
Well, I mean, the obvious one that comes to mind is Brittany Griner going to Russia, which obviously, she wasn't thrown in jail for being queer explicitly. But I've always sort of interpreted it as, the undertone is oh, look, this famous Black gay lady from the United States, that would sure send a message.
Mm.
And I mean, right, you look at what she was arrested on, which was there were cartridges with traces of cannabis oil in them.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's just completely an excuse, which although most travelers probably aren't drawing the kind of scrutiny that would have someone looking for that kind of thing, especially in countries like Russia, there's this increasing problem with hostage diplomacy where they arrest Americans and then the US is well, we'd kind of like our people back, and then we have to trade them sexual murderers. It seems being visibly queer could definitely be something that puts you at higher risk.
Yeah. So I guess Travel and Leisure used the Gay Travel Index from Spartacus, which I will also link to, and is also, I have to say, a very pretty map. I'm really liking all of these colorful visual aids, but they use categories ranging from marriage for all to the death penalty for homosexuals, which obviously puts you at the bottom of the list. This index, it says, attempts to strike a balance between the rights of the local LGBTQ plus community and the demands of queer vacationers. So the safety of vacationers, as well as increasing the visibility of abuses, are important. So they're trying to kind of give you an evaluation so you can decide where you want to go. In their rankings, which go from 1 to 210, the US is 41, which is not terrible, but I think lukewarm was a fair way to characterize that. Another interesting angle I saw in which the countries are ranked is the Global Citizens Solutions, which helps people find quote unquote citizenship solutions. I interpret this as relocation for wealthy people. But it is kind of an interesting, okay, what do they say? Where do they say you should move if you have resources and, you want to live somewhere queer friendly? It is similar. The best are Portugal, Finland, Norway, Iceland, Belgium, Denmark, Spain, Canada, the Netherlands, and of course, Malta, which apparently was the first country in the European Union to prohibit corrective therapy and guarantee equal rights and freedoms to LGBTQ citizens. Obviously, not a lot of Asian, African, or South American countries showing up on these lists. Those are vastly different cultures. What is it that you think makes those regions less tolerant?
I'll tell you what I think it is: colonialism.
Explain.
It's ultimately the same thing that when we talk about, what makes those less wealthy countries, what makes them less safe countries, any of the other metrics that we use to decide, is this a desirable place to move? Like, a lot of places in Asia, South America, and Africa aren't coming up on those lists either. Climate friendliness, right? Like, these are countries that have been colonized for, 200 years at a minimum. And so we're never sort of given the benefit of the Industrial Revolution, the Enlightenment period, all of these things that have sort of resulted in Western European culture being so globally dominant. And so a certain way of looking at it, and this is like the most basic possible approach, it's much more nuanced in my opinion, but is that these countries were effectively stunted in their development and are therefore behind, quote unquote, Western civilization. Again, that's like a very, very reductive way of looking at it. And there's a ton of research, right, into, well, that sort of assumes that all cultures will ultimately follow the same path and blah, 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 blah. And that's not true, right? But there is truth in the idea that, well, yes, they have not been given the resources to develop technologically. They have been so concerned. I mean, this is something that we touched on a few weeks ago in our episode on Palestine and Israel, right? Like, if you are concerned with, are my neighbors going to bomb me into oblivion, then you're not going to be super concerned with, can I get married? I mean, we see that during periods of war in, the developed countries as well, right? Like during World War I, World War II, any conflict that you point to with any given country, you tend to see a sort of relapse when it comes to civil liberties and social acceptance. And so we're talking about countries that, for a lot of them, have just been locked in that period for hundreds of years. And so, yeah, it's not terribly surprising that that hasn't been a major point of focus. There's also the fact that a lot of more conservative Western values have been imported into those countries and then sort of caught on for various reasons. There are a lot of countries where a very conservative Christianity has become popular as a way of, indigenizing it, or women finding power in ways that they didn't necessarily in traditional society. Like, again, it's very dependent on each society and what people's needs were at the time that resources were given. I think something that we often miss when we talk about this issue is that we sometimes look at it as just colonizers imposing their will on people. And while that's true to a certain extent, there's also an element of, colonized people were also capable of looking at the culture that they're being handed and saying, here are the things that I would like to draw on. And something that we've seen pop up in some places, especially Africa, is this notion of, well, now this is our Christianity, and we're going to take some elements, right, like this notion of marriage between a man and a woman, and that becomes a way of asserting independence. And suddenly it becomes a form of resistance to new colonialism. So there are certain leaders, and there are, organizations in the Western world dedicated to pushing this narrative as well, that say, oh, accepting queerness is a way of suppressing the Black birth rate. It's a new form of colonialism. And so there are all sorts of various like forces and narratives that are going on, largely in response to colonialism. If you look at pre-colonial times in a lot of these places, there were very vastly different ways of understanding queerness. And, they would have positive elements and negative elements. And it's not to say that, anywhere was a paradise for queer people before colonialism, but, it was just as varied as any other sample you take of people. And then colonialism has again really sort of warped and taken away what progress might have looked like without that force.
Interesting, because I remember talking about, the cultures in which transgender people existed in various forms, whether a third gender, all of that stuff. And a lot of those are parts of the world that now are on that list of not friendly places. So you are saying that, while those societies may have embraced or at least tolerated those kinds of, I guess, what we would call non-traditional gender roles or relationships or whatever, that then colonists came in and basically said, like, no, you guys are primitive and here's the civilized way to do this.
Yeah, exactly. And that was very consistently like it was seen as one of the main pillars of civilization was, correct gender norms. So one of the narratives that you would often see with Africans and indigenous peoples in the Americas was that actually indigenous peoples all over the world really was this narrative of, oh, these men are so weak and lazy. They make women go out and do the gathering food, and they go out and kill a bison, and then they come back and lay around all day and smoke, and that's it. We have to help these poor women. And again, it wasn't a one-way thing. Like there were societies where women did embrace some of those elements because they were beneficial to them. But because that was such a central pillar of the quote unquote civilizing project, that obviously left no room for those third or alternate gender options that may have existed previously.
The irony, of course, being that a lot of the countries that went in and did that are now the ones that are progressive, like score better on these scales. They left this, like, I don't know, antiquated view in the places they colonized and then went off and like progressed as societies.
Yeah, I mean, I think the comparison to green energy is actually probably a really good one, not to pat myself on the back. I mean, it's right. Effectively, Western Europeans went in, took resources, and then left behind, the crappy technology, monopolized the resources they had, like used them in a very exploitative manner, destroyed the planet, went through the whole industrial revolution, and now they can be like, yeah, look at us, we got green energy. And meanwhile, everyone else is still stuck relying on more damaging forms of energy. And then oftentimes you'll have, politicians in the United States will point at developing countries and be like, well, look at them. Look at all of their coal emissions. Look at how bad they are for the planet. When in reality, the United States is still really bad, right? And that's the thing, is by then kind of using developing countries as a scapegoat, you can then say, we don't have any problems. We're not the issue here. Why are you blaming us for how badly queer people are treated?
Mm-hmm. Like that argument we've talked about before that, conservatives here like to say, well, look how badly they treat gay people in those countries.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah. An interesting one, actually, though, one of the worst offenders when it comes to colonialism is Great Britain, which is not doing so hot.
Yeah, then that's a trend that it's a trend all across Europe, right? And so it actually is less, which countries are doing really great things for queer people and more which countries are not actively backsliding.
Yeah.
The US, unfortunately, being one of the ones that's actively backsliding. Great Britain also being one that's actively backsliding. And I think another thing that's important to keep in mind, you're also talking about the lenses through which you can look at queer friendliness in a given country. But I mean, you can also look at it in a much broader way, right? In, quality of life metrics, like how affordable is healthcare? I mean, that affects everybody, but who it especially affects is trans people who rely on gender affirming healthcare throughout their lives. How, what are the country's immigration policies? Because if a country treats refugees badly, then queer people who might rely on the refugee system will also be treated badly. Queer immigrants who might not be actively persecuted in the same way as countries that might produce queer refugees, but still, aren't accepted in their society. If they're being treated badly when they move somewhere, then, and I mean, racial equality, right? If a country treats Black people poorly, then I mean, it's going to treat Black queer people especially poorly, which is something we see in the United States. And so, although we can look at very specific policies targeting queer people, marriage equality, gender recognition, adoption policies, all those things, you also have to take into account just general social well being. And sometimes those tend to overlap, right? Like a lot of the countries you listed as being most welcoming to queer people tend to have, free healthcare. But in some ways, they're not necessarily. They also tend to have pretty restrictive immigration policies.
Hmm. Yeah, I was thinking, like, I remember looking at that human rights list. I don't remember specifically like other countries, but I know that on a broad list of human rights, civil liberty, Switzerland was really high, but they are not topping these lists. Do you think that it just has to do with like that being a place that most people can't afford to live? So
Yeah.
even though they have, really a really good human rights practice and laws and all of that, it's not friendly for marginalized people per se.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't know, and I would love to see the breakdown of the ways that these lists are being calculated precisely. But yeah, and if that's not being taken into account, it should be, right? Because if no one can afford to live there, then people who are more likely to, not make as much money or be dealing with comorbid isn't the right word, but coexisting social factors that increase your cost of living or decrease your resources, less family support, for instance, then it's not a friendly place for queer people, right?
Yeah, it's interesting to just kind of think about some of the countries that France obviously has very liberal, like organized religion isn't that popular, obviously has very liberal views. Look at the opening ceremony scandal, but also not doing well on these lists. Would you, and I'm asking you to just speculate on things that obviously you haven't researched, but I'm running through lists in my head now of countries that do really well on some measures, but France is also very intolerant when it comes to things that are not of their culture.
Religious freedom.
So maybe that's one of those things that, like, yes, on its face, they're very accepting of, queerness and transgenderism and things like that. But it would be really very difficult to be a queer Muslim escaping persecution in a Muslim country and going to France, because
Right.
then you're being persecuted for other reasons.
Yep. Yeah, and I mean, it again, coming back to our conversation about Israel and Palestine, right? Like Tel Aviv is like a gay tourism destination, and Israel loves to market itself as the beacon of LGBTQ rights in the Middle East. But if you're blackmailing queer Palestinians, if you are refusing queer Palestinians asylum, then you're not white privileged gay people can generally get along fine most places actually. And that's been true throughout history and even in other places, right? If you're part of the ruling class, you can do what you want, and unless something goes really really wrong, no one cares and no one has the resources to do anything about you doing anything quote unquote wrong. I mean, rich people commit crimes all the time. Homosexuality is a crime in that context, but no one's going to do anything about it. And I mean, to an extent, that's still true today. Like, if you're really well off, you can go to any country in the world and build yourself a little castle on a hill and have all the gay sex you want, and no one's going to do anything about it. Those aren't the gay people that we need to be concerned about. Those aren't the queer people that we need to have in mind when we're looking at these lists. And I think that's something that gets missed sometimes when, in discussions of Israel being queer friendly, of really, really high cost of living countries being queer friendly. Like, that's a fundamental part of the issue. And rich queer people are never going to have as much trouble as other queer people. They're not the ones who need a really affirming, safe country to live in. And so, that shouldn't be the lens through which we look at things.
Right. You're not really walking the walk if you're only accepting certain kinds of queer people.
Right.
Interesting stuff. So that's just scratching the surface. There's so much information out there. I recommend you, clicking on some of these resources that we're going to post and kind of seeing where that takes you and doing a deeper dive because, as you can see from this brief conversation, a lot of different things at play. It's a sort of a sociological gold mine if you want to dig in.
And, you always have to keep in mind, I think, as you do start looking into that data doesn't always capture lived experience either. There are queer people in Russia, again, relatively well-off queer people, but queer people who are like, this is fine, like whatever. And there are queer people in Russia who get arrested. And I mean, we just talked about how Great Britain hasn't been doing particularly well. And yet simultaneously, we went to London a year and a half ago, and I was there and I'm like, oh my God, this feels like so much of a better place to be non-binary than any city I've been in the United States. Like, it feels like a world of difference. And of course, that's not true for, everywhere in the UK. But the difference between London and major US cities was still massive to me experientially, even if it might not line up any different on paper.
What, just really quickly, like what are a couple of examples?
So, I mean, there were gender neutral bathrooms everywhere. And frequently it wasn't necessarily single stall gender bathrooms either, gender neutral bathrooms either. It was, there would be just a row of stalls that were completely closed off and then sinks that were just, open because who cares if anyone sees you washing your hands? And yeah, it was just like much more chill in that regard. And then I don't know, it seemed like there were so many queer people everywhere and so much playing with gender roles that it just felt very like nobody was looking at you askance or like seeing it as weird.
Be interesting to see what happens there over the next few years. And the rest of Europe, is, there's a backsliding going on in various places. The US, Great Britain are examples. And I'm wondering, are we at the front of the pack and things are going to get worse progressively in other countries? Or is this just unique to, I don't know.
I can tell you we're not at the front of the pack, right? Like Poland and Hungary are for sure, really these kind of hotbeds of Christian nationalism right now.
Did they get there first? Did they get there before, I don't know, let's say 2016?
Yes, I think so. And interestingly, if you look at Russia, although Russia has never been particularly open, there was a period, and it's actually comparable to China as well. There was a period in the early 2000s where there was a lot more social experimentation going on. And then you saw the rise of these two sort of strongmen authoritarian leaders, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, respectively. And then, of course, Viktor Orban in Hungary. And with the return of authoritarianism in those countries, that has been sort of the pulling force in that backsliding, right? So, and same thing goes with the United States, right? And it's why I always say that, yes, we should be very concerned about erosion of democracy in the United States. But when we talk about things, things like abortion access, things like gay marriage, things like transgender healthcare, and just, anti-drag bills, it's not a separate thing, right? they're all mixed up because authoritarians always want to crack down on dissent, and queerness is inherently dissenting against the mainstream of society. It's almost the definition of queerness. And so queer people are always going to be a target for authoritarians as we see this authoritarian surge in the United States with Trump at the vanguard, but certainly not the only person pushing it. Yeah, I think that is going to be a major force in whether or not LGBTQ rights continue to deteriorate. And I think it's true of other countries too, right? If other countries can successfully resist figures like, Giorgia Meloni in Italy, who is literally like basically a neo-fascist, Marine Le Pen in France, basically. So like to me, despite the fact that France has a lot of problems going on, the fact that, they voted against Marine Le Pen in this huge surprise election is still a positive sign.
Yeah.
Because resisting that authoritarian urge and resisting the far right and resisting neo-fascist groups is a sign that, the society wants to remain open.
Yeah. No, the French don't like being told what to do, so maybe that helps. To the barricades. Let's hope that this is a blip on the march of progress in those countries. And meanwhile, Scandinavia, Europe, Uruguay was interesting.
Yeah.
I have to do a little more reading on that. But yes, there is our helpful guide. On our next episode, we'll take a deeper dive into a related issue, why it's important for any society to have pro-LGBTQ plus policies. It goes way beyond making life easier for queer people. The effects of anti-queer mentalities that lead to people being kicked out of the house or shunned from groups or losing safety nets in any number of ways have ripple effects throughout all of society and influence homelessness, drug use, and trafficking, among other issues. So we'll take a look at that on our next episode. Enjoy the last fleeting days of summer here as everybody returns to school and whatnot. And we'll catch you next time.
Bye. If you found this podcast helpful, interesting, or just mildly amusing, please consider rating and reviewing us on your podcasting platform of choice. It really helps us to get the word out there and spread this information as far as we can.
And as always, check out our website at queerkidsstraightmom.com or visit us on Facebook, Queer Kid Straight Mom, Instagram at queerkid.straightmom, or Twitter at queerkidstr, the number 8, mom.
And if you're feeling especially generous, please consider joining our Patreon by searching Queer Kids Straight Mom. It helps us fund this podcast.